Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending the AAJA APANO panel. We'll do a few quick introductions first. I'm Amy Wang, and I am the president of AAJA Portland, which has been around since, I would say the 90s. We are a chapter of the National Asian American Journalists Association. Our board treasurer, Elliot Noose, is not visible, but is moderating this chat. So just to let everybody know, he's in the room as well. With me today, we have the pleasure of Duncan Huan from APANO. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Duncan Huang. I use he, his pronouns, and I'm the associate director at APANO. I've been there for over 8 years now, and I've been able to witness kind of our growth and increasing impact, hopefully, in Oregon.
Great. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we get rolling. We're going to ask that everybody stay on mute, but we do invite your questions, and if you can just drop those in the chat. And as I said, our moderator, Elliot Noose, will be keeping an eye on the chat for any questions that you have. Today, I thought we would start our conversation with Duncan telling us a little bit about who APANO is, what they do, and how they can be a resource for Oregon news media.
Sure. Well, APANO is actually, so we're two sister organizations. We're Oregon Community, APANO Community United Fund, excuse me, and that's our C3 entity, and that's where we do a bulk of our work. We do community organizing, advocacy, community development, and like leadership development as well. And then APANO is just our, just the APANO name is our C4 entity. And that's where we do our lobbying and political endorsements and candidate work. So we're separate entities with separate boards, but work really closely together. Altogether, we have about a team of 40 and kind of split across all our programs. And we also spend a lot of time and energy in our communications. So we have 3 full-time folks in our communications department. And yeah, this is just such a valuable conversation for me, just to get to know folks in the reporting and news business, because that's a lot of the work that we want to do, is to share out our stories.
And you are a resource not only locally, but nationally. Can you talk a little bit about that, because you've been part of both local and national stories in recent weeks?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think we've been, like many Asian Pacific Islander-led organizations, we've been contributing to the narrative around the rise in hate crimes towards our community. So in venues like PBS, and I was like in a People magazine article about some of the vandalism that occurred on 82nd. So I think there's that element. And then a lot of the stuff that we do is also pretty groundbreaking here in Oregon compared to the rest of the country. So, we worked with our small business clients on the Portland delivery fee cap for like DoorDash and Postmates, and, those types of companies that were charging sometimes 30 to 60% of revenues, basically. So we were able to work with the city of Portland to get a cap at 10%, and that was like the strongest in the country. So also had a lot of press around that as well. So yeah, I think that kind of speaks to the impact that we can have and hope to have, and kind of is recognized around the country for some of our kind of like most kind of groundbreaking progressive policies.
I wanted to provide a moment here for people to ask questions specifically about APANO if they have any. So this would be a time when you can unmute. If you have any questions specifically for Duncan about APANO and its mission or its work, this would be a time to raise your hand or speak up.
Oh, Amy, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. You would think after a year and change of this, I would have this down. I'm not hearing any questions, so we'll move on. But if anybody does have a question about APANO that comes to mind later on, feel free to drop it in the chat and we can address it. In the meantime, we'll move on to the first part of our discussion today, which is about best practices for covering AAPI stories and issues. And Duncan was kind enough to send a couple links to stories that he thought were really well done in this regard. So I'm going to go ahead and drop those links into the chat. And in reading these stories myself, a couple of things came to mind that I wanted to discuss with you today. And the first thing that came to mind was about sourcing. One of the stories here is actually an episode of OPB's Think Out Loud program. And the three sources in that episode were all members of the AAPI population. One of them is Ali Yee, who is with APANO. Can you talk a little bit about how APANO contributed to the sourcing, if it did, on that story?
Well, I mean, in all honesty, like all three of the speakers were affiliated with APANO. So Yejun Kwan, who is the Reed professor, is actually one of our board members, and Ali Yee is our communications director, and RFU, who was the person that talked about his experience with hate crime, was also a staffer at APANO. But he's also a student, so he worked on our census project. So they were all kind of, in our I guess pretty close network, and we've been able to build a pretty great relationship with OPB over the last year or two. And this is not the first time they ran a story about AAPI hate. There was also a story earlier last year. So I think if you look at the Department of Justice data, there was a spike kind of in the beginning of the pandemic, and then over the last 2 or 3 months, another spike as well. So OPB has been running those stories in different forms over the last year. So yeah, I think we've just been really, through our work, been able to collect stories from the community about what's happening like on the ground, and also through our board and relationships with like academics, PSU and Reed, also kind of being able to put that into the historical context as well.
So before that Think Out Loud episode aired, did you have any sort of relationship with OPB as a source, or was that the first time that they had approached you?
No, I mean, I was on OPB Think Out Loud probably in May of last year on a similar story, but that was kind of like new. And then we've talked to OPB a few times on different issues, and I just saw that Sam is moving to Minnesota, but I think that's one of our closest friends and allies at OPB.
Yeah, producer Samantha Matsumoto, who has been a producer on Think Out Loud. Yes, she's left OPB, sadly.
Yes,
sadly. And then the other story that I dropped into the chat is from PBS. They did a national story that centered the voices of AAPI business owners and leaders. What are some ways that Oregon journalists could build a source list that includes diversity like that?
Are you talking about a source list of folks to talk to?
Yeah, right.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think it's just spending kind of some time in relationship and community. I think that's always been helpful. Like for me, like I don't know most people here, but I know a few kind of reporters or media folks that if I have something, I can always kind of reach out to. And I think having that kind of relationship where it's not just a story on deadline where you're like, I need a quote in 10 minutes kind of thing. I think that'd be really valuable. I think both for you all professionally, but also for me professionally too, right? And also we're all kind of like members of this like Asian or Pacific Islander diaspora. So I think it'd be great to have that connection in general. So I really invite folks to reach out and get to know Ali or myself or, folks on our comms team. And I think that, those can be, long-term, fruitful relationships. I think recently we've just been like getting so many media inquiries about, can I talk to someone who experienced a hate or bias incidents, or can I talk to a small business owner that's been impacted by vandalism or, by the pandemic? And like those kind of relationships actually do also take a lot of like nurturing and ongoing support. So on our end, when we get those requests, that's using our like human political, capital, if you will, to like make those connections and be like, hey, business owner, do you want to talk to this reporter, kind of thing. So all that kind of requires, for it to be kind of the most impactful and the least transactional. Like there has to be some like relationship and trust building there. So we do that, and I encourage you all to do that as well.
There is a question that's come in through the chat. How might local media be a resource for APANO?
Yeah, so like, we get inquiries and I kind of like broke them down for the last year. Like the stories that we get inquiries are about vaccinations, how are vaccines going? And, many of our communities are underrepresented in vaccinations and why, right? And then small businesses, how are they being impacted by the pandemic? What kind of challenges are they facing? Have they experienced like hate and bias incidents? And then, hate crimes, like if something happens in, in Oregon, if someone is attacked, which has happened, many times over the last couple of months, like, we often get a quote. So I think that like those are newsworthy, but I think what we really want to do at APANO is to, push back on harmful narratives that are kind of targeting our community. I think we're consistently in this battle of like, battle of a narrative, like, are immigrants like, rapists and murderers, like, former President Trump would say, or are we, contributing and important and valuable members of our society? And that's kind of a narrative that like, we always want to be pushing. So I think, like when we put out stories, that's what we want to tell is like, lifting up our leaders, our stories, and, creating that kind of narrative where it's not like every story isn't kind of like a negative story of like, being a victim or, talking about this like specific disparity or something like that.
Another thing. Yes, I think so. That was actually Andrew's question. So hopefully, Andrew, that worked for you. Another thing that struck me when I looked at these stories that you shared is that they both included a lot of context. There was an emphasis on how did we get here? What has APANO found as good sources, reliable sources of context, data, et cetera, that you think journalists should know about?
Well, I think it's, really issue specific. And, I think for hate and bias incidents, for example, we always go to the Department of Justice. I think they have the most rigorous kind of reporting and documentation process. I think we can also get data from the National Stop AAPI Hate organization that's tracking things across the country. And then I think, specifically depending on kind of the issue area, I would work with, the Department of Education on educational disparities, or, the Housing Bureau and Metro on kind of like how homelessness and housing insecurity is impacting our community. Now, I will say that like the data points have been there and are well documented and have existed forever. And I think our decision makers know about them, or at least kind of like leadership in the various kind of like public agencies. And frankly, that hasn't done a whole lot. I think it's really required us as an organization and as a community to lift up stories to complement that data and to force the issue and to raise the issue. So the disparity is always there, but like, what do we do about it, right? And that really requires us to be able to move hearts and minds.
I want to go back to a point that you made earlier when we talked about how in the OPB story, we had a young man, Arthur Yang, who told his specific experiences in a broader story about anti-Asian attacks and hate. And you also talked about how, you've been fielding a lot of media inquiries who want to talk to somebody now who can talk about a specific incident. How do journalists find people without doing harm? You know what I'm saying?
Oh gosh, yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think when we field requests like that, like if you report your incident to the Department of Justice, you're asked whether or not you're willing to share your story and whether or not you need follow-up resources. So like if you call the Department of Justice and you want additional support, you might be connected with us, and then we'll talk to you more individually. So I think we're kind of doing that vetting while we're also trying to link victims up with kind of the resources they need. And a lot of times, with microaggressions, it's just like they just want someone to talk to about it and to know that like other people like are experiencing it too, and they can process it. I think that's a role that we can play. And sometimes it's actually more serious where they're like, oh, I need like legal support, I need to like get somewhere safe. I think there's that avenue. And then I don't know if Corinna mentioned the Juan Nguyen article that the Oregonian put out that was picked up by a number of media outlets. But Hua, who's a candidate for, I think, Reynolds School Board, is one of our tier 1 kind of candidates that we're endorsing and campaigning for. She actually wanted to share her story, and she said after the incident, so basically someone knocked on her door at 6 a.m. and put up like a racist message on her door that I think it was like, go back to your country or something of that vein. And she sat on it for a while, and she's like, no, I'm going to share my story. And she actively, wanted to share it out. So we worked on her and created a press release, and then the media contact was one of our political staff, and we sent it out to the Oregonian, and you all ran an article, and it was pushed out to other media sources, and she did like 5 TV interviews over the coming days. So I think there are people that like, especially after the murders in Atlanta, are like, this happened to me and I want to talk about it and I'm going to share it. So, and it takes that kind of resolve and courage, and I think we're also here to support that. So maybe like when people want to share a story like that's worth listening to.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a great comment in the section that in the chat, that AAPIdata.com is great for demographics and policy issues. So thank you, Jamie Ding, for sharing that resource. And then we have a question from Marty Patel, who is actually one of our AAJA Portland board members. And he asks, when media members interview people in the AAPI community who have experienced hate crimes or discrimination, are there do's and don'ts for questions to ask or things to avoid? How can we make sure we're approaching those difficult conversations appropriately?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question. And like I said, I think it really kind of happens in the preparation and making sure that the person that's going to speak out, wants to be there and is ready for it. So like when Hua wanted to come up forward, we had some pretty lengthy conversations about, what it would mean and the kind of attention you'd get. And we also were, concerned about her safety. So we like made sure that she had a friend stay over, or she stayed at a friend's house, or we were able to, have her be at an Airbnb when the story first hit. So I don't know that there's, specific do's and don'ts. I think it's really case dependent about how ready and willing folks are to share. But I think if people don't want to share, they wouldn't be in that interview, or, I think they should just be empowered to say, I don't want to talk about that, and can we move on, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then another question has popped up, so I'm just going to field it now. This one is from Eder Campuzano, an Oregonian reporter. I'm curious, does it ever get tiring to have reporters approach you during times of crisis rather than, say, when you're celebrating a meaningful occasion? And by that, I mean if it feels like you're being approached almost exclusively during times of crisis, you being APANO.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely it is tiring. I think in in late March, early April, we probably did 20 to 30 interviews, and oftentimes they're on deadline, and it's also on difficult subject matter, and that they happen just unexpectedly. So if we're doing our work and then someone is assaulted in Salem and then the media calls, you're like, well, we gotta respond to it. So yes, absolutely, it is tiring, but it's also, I think, part of our responsibility and work to respond to the moment. So I think it's a push-pull. I mean, would I like to have other stories told? Absolutely. Yeah, I think we also get a fair number of asks in May, because May is starting in a couple of days, and it's Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So at least government jurisdictions usually do kind of like a proclamation, and there might be a couple of news stories. So I think that's more standard and more celebratory. But I'd really like to be able to talk about kind of the other stories that are impacting our community kind of more year round, and not always just about whatever crisis is at hand at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And Andrew DeVigo has a follow-up question, which is, are there examples when local media has authentically established a less extractive engagement with APANO?
I don't know that there's like great examples. I think before this session, we were just remembering when Helen Zia came to town, and after Helen Zia's book reading at Powell's, we all went to Henry's and had a drink. And I think more activities like that are really important. So we can maybe have like a AAJA APANO happy hour or something when it's safe. And I think our staff have actually just been really hungry for that. They were so excited to meet folks at that event. Like, oh, this is great. Like, these are people I want to talk to, and I think we can be more intentional about that going forward. I think the extraction piece is like a really important consideration, but it's like, I know you all have got a job to do, and it's important that you tell the story and you do a good job telling it. And we all have a job to do too. And our job is to also tell the stories and make sure it gets out and, has the impact and message that we want, right? So I wouldn't see it as, I don't feel like it's extractive. I just wish it was more of a partnership. So, and I think that's something that we can
Great.
Hopefully facilitate someday.
Yeah, there's some comments now popping up in the chat about maybe doing a meet and greet. Mila from KGW is suggesting that a meet and greet at their newsroom, just to get to know each other and establish a relationship, which goes back to your earlier point about relationship building, so that people aren't suddenly popping out of the blue and asking for stuff. I wanted to go back. I wanted to use that as a segue into opportunities, because one of the other pieces that you shared was an opinion piece that APANO's interim executive director, Kathleen Holt, co-authored, that ran in the Oregonian. What are, that's an avenue that we don't always think of, especially those of us on the news side, because we're separate from opinion. But what other opportunities for engagement could we see there? Another thing that brings to mind for me is that at the Oregonian, we have all these multiple social media platforms where we see a slightly different audience than we do on the website and in print.
So it's a question more about like how do we
what opportunities are there for engagement with APANO through the media other than just the standard news story? And using the opinion as one example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that opinion piece was kind of facilitated by Meyer Memorial Trust, who actually I think had a former Oregonian, reporter as
right.
So I thought that was a great example, and it ran kind of like the day after the shootings in Atlanta, so it was just so timely. And even though we had been working on it for a couple of weeks, but yeah, I think the opinion pieces are really important, especially when we're trying to pass our agenda or advance our agenda. So I think like that avenue and amplifying kind of our policy asks would be great. And maybe you can do that kind of, in your professional and personal networks as well. Like after kind of this last month, we put together, a pretty ambitious agenda for the state legislature and local jurisdictions to actually do something to, address kind of this rise in anti-Asian sentiment. And I think it's fine to put out statements and opinion pieces, but I think what we're looking for is concrete action.
So, you just mentioned that agenda is pretty ambitious, and that actually brings me to another issue I wanted to talk about, which is comprehensiveness. A story that tells you not just that something is happening, but why and the impact of something happening. That one to me, it butts up against a fundamental tension in our business, which is that ideally every story would be comprehensive and thoroughly reported, but there are these things called deadlines, and there is some pressure from competition wanting to get the story up quickly. So what's a good way for us to balance that? I mean, on the one hand, we want to avoid the one source story that isn't fully complete, but on the other hand, we are under pressure to make those deadlines and get those stories posted quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of an example kind of in the vaccine storytelling where it was like a very incomplete story, and they wanted to tell about the challenges at the convention center and communities experience it, and they only talked to me. And I think that kind of like first of all, like I'm not a public health expert, and second of all, I don't represent all the communities that are kind of have disparate vaccination rates. So that was just like an incomplete article. And I think, not calling up at, like an hour before your deadline, asking for a quote kind of thing is probably, the best step. And, the article about Hua Nguyen in the Oregonian actually had a lot of updated information from the Department of Justice and actually provided, a much fuller context. So I think stories where it's like you have multiple sources that you're quoting and also, citing specific data is actually, much, I'm sure you all know, it's much better reporting than, a short 2 or 3 paragraph article with a single source. And I think to do that, it requires a good deal of preparation, like that OPP article with Ellie and Yejun and Arthur. I think we worked on that for 2 or 3 weeks before it got on the radio and got everyone there. And, we all planned our talking points, and, it felt like a really, cohesive story, right? You had like the big picture narrative, you had the current context, and you had the personal story. And I think that's what made that article so compelling to me, was like it was well thought out, well researched, covered multiple viewpoints, and it had the time that needed to like marinate and tell that complete story.
Yeah, it's something that, I think about a lot, is that tension between you want to get the story up quickly, especially in response to a very big story like Atlanta, but at the same time, you know, maybe taking that extra day or two is worth the wait because you'll have a more thoughtful, comprehensive story. So where do you see, you mentioned the one story where you were quoted as a single source, you were the single source quoted, you're not a public health official, about a story about vaccine inequity, and none of the other groups mentioned in the story had anyone quoted to represent them as an example for a story that had some room for improvement. Where else do you see room for improvement in news coverage of AAPI folks and issues and stories?
Gosh, I think it's really taking the time to like be part of a community and like listen and then actually like craft stories that come out of a community. I think there's just so many rich stories or untold stories that could be, highlighted. And that's, I think, what we're really looking for, right? It shouldn't just be about vaccine rates or graduation rates or hate crimes. There's just so many stories, and they aren't being told. So that, I guess that's pretty simple, but like tell more stories that are have different viewpoints and different kind of I guess like goals and points to them. Like it's not just about kind of a deficiency mindset, but like how do we approach storytelling from a community, like a place of strength and community assets.
Well, actually, that was going to be our next bullet point. So I was hoping that, Duncan, you might elaborate. What stories do you feel are really going untold at this time in Oregon that we should be telling? Who are we not talking to that we should be talking to? What are some issues that are going completely ignored that are very important to the AAPI folks in Oregon?
Yeah. Well, I just said don't start from a place of deficiency, but I do want to highlight a couple of things, right? Like, the AAPI community in Oregon's and throughout the country is now the fastest growing demographic, and the community has just grown so fast in Oregon the last 20 years. And I think when the census numbers come out, you'll see that kind of even more fully. But the nonprofit ecosystem, I feel like in Oregon has not caught up. So a couple of years ago, the Coalition of Communities of Color put out a report, and they found that 0.1% of philanthropic giving actually went to Asian Pacific Islander-led organizations. That's 0.1%. So I think that speaks to a state of like underinvestment in our community. And I think when things happen, right, like there aren't that many voices that speak up because of that chronic underinvestment. So if you compare us to one of our peer cities, like in Seattle or in Oakland, like when hate crimes happen, there's 5 groups that you can tap into, and it's taxing for an organization like us or Pacific Islander Asian Family Center to like carry the torch basically for the whole community, because there aren't enough kind of like well capacitized like nonprofits. So I know a lot of our partners like with the Hmong American community or the Cambodian American community, like they all just need resources and infrastructure, and they're not getting it, right? So it's like even in the vaccine kind of world, like there are financial resourcing opportunities for folks to do vaccine promotion and enrollment, but like you have to have a nonprofit that you can grant to, and that doesn't exist. And on an issue area like in Chinatown, San Francisco, there's multiple community development corporations building affordable housing, or there's one agency that does workforce development for Asian Americans. In Oregon, we don't have any of those entities. So I think that's what's missing, right? It's like our system is our ecosystems maybe 10, 15 years underdeveloped. And like we need to catch up so that all the community members can get all the kind of resources they need. So I think that's one untold story, and having a broader infrastructure, spreads the work around instead of concentrating them in one org like APANO sort of thing. I think one thing I'm really excited about is the number of Asian American candidates that are running for office. So many running for school board, and I want to shout out, one of my former colleagues, Representative Khan Pham, who's the first Asian American legislator in 20 years. So like politically, we just haven't had kind of a seat at the table or a presence really until more recently. And like having that has been a seismic shift in a lot of ways. Like I don't think that we'd be seeing any real action on Asian hate crimes if it weren't for that kind of leadership. Like, Rep Pham is really carrying the torch for like, we got to spend some money on supporting this issue and the victims here, and really investing in what will make our communities feel safer and have the resources they need to be strong and thriving. And I think there's just so many examples of like local leaders stepping up during challenging times that are untold. Like one of our organizers at the beginning of the pandemic raised money from the Chinese community and ordered thousands and thousands of masks from China when no one could get masks, and distributed them to TriMet or hospitals. And that was like what was like providing PPE for the first couple months, right? And that story really wasn't told either. So people are just doing some really innovative and amazing things, and it's kind of just in the background. And instead we get stories like Asian Americans are being attacked, but there's not that counter narrative of like Asian Americans are doing really important things for our community.
Yeah, that brings to mind a recent story where we were trying to find some Asian American organizations to speak to the topic of the story. And it just struck me that a lot of those organizations are very rarely contacted or quoted in Oregon media. And I was wondering how often APANO partners with other AAPI organizations in Oregon, and whether you feel some of them deserve to be better known as sources and resources.
Oh, I mean, absolutely, right? I think it's like, it's not accurate or fair for APANO to be like the voice of Asian Americans. That is not true. And, we represent, like Asian Americans, like Asian people are like 60% of humanity, right? So it's like a huge diaspora. There's, multitude of voices and opinions. And I think we represent a very small slice of that, where, we have our own set of values and mission statement, and, the way we see the world and the theory of change. And that doesn't represent everyone. And that's, totally fine. But I think that the other voices aren't being reached out to. So in our work, we do have, we do play some of a convening role. Like we convene what we call the vote network. And we have about 15 kind of member organizations. And our goal is to, originally was to work with them on civic engagement. And we provide some technical assistance and pass-through funding, but I think it's grown more now to be also tackling kind of the pandemic. So we're able to do kind of pass-through funding and some assistance, and hopefully being able to grow and develop that ecosystem more, and with a special focus on kind of like the most marginalized communities, like from Southeast Asia or from Pacific Islands. And then there are just like other like really well-established organizations that are like much older than we are, like the Chinese American Citizens Alliance or the Japanese American Citizens Alliance. Like, those organizations have been around for hundreds of years and have also been tapped on. But I think it's really more specifically kind of like when issues or challenges arise, in those communities. So I think, yeah, just how do we have a more diverse pool of spokespeople and organizations is just so critical.
Is there a centralized list somewhere of Oregon AAPI organizations?
Gosh, I don't think there's one formally. I think we have our vote partner kind of list, but I don't think just because we're all Asian doesn't mean we all agree on everything, and or want to associate one another in a lot of ways. I don't know that there's like one central list, nor do I think that would be kind of helpful in many ways. I think it's really about if you want to write a story about what's happening in Myanmar or something, like you should really build that relationship with activists working on that story. Like there are some amazing organizers doing some great work here in Portland with holding kind of rallies on a weekly basis and really elevating kind of attention on those types of issues. And we don't do anything with like national or really international affairs, but there's so much going on in the Philippines or Myanmar or in China with like the Uyghur population, just like so many stories to tell and so many activists working on it, but they're not getting the attention at all.
You mean local activists?
Yeah, local and national, sure.
We have a question in the chat from Jonathan Bach, who asks, how can business reporters be better resources for Portland's AAPI community and less tokenizing when covering economic/business related news in the city?
I would say that I think the immigrant small business community is often invisibilized and really kind of needs more of a spotlight or an ability to tell their stories. And just a bit about me, like I grew up in a Chinese restaurant. My mom opened the first Chinese restaurant in Upper Michigan, where I'm from. But like the challenges and experiences that we had are never really told in mainstream media. So I think just being more intentional about that and thinking about that more is like there's like a sector of the economy that doesn't really exist in the mainstream. Like even when you talk about like eater.com and like Portland Dumpling Week, like last year one restaurant finally made it on, but it's like we serve dumplings out here in East Portland like every day, and no one ever writes about that. But when a fancy downtown restaurant makes dumplings, it's suddenly like a media story, right? So it's like how are you elevating stories of the day-to-day that's happening in the business community here? Yeah, so I would just think more about that. And also just like I think when our small business community gets highlighted, it's for bad reasons, right? It's like they were attacked or they were vandalized, or the Chinese herb shops got raided because they were selling pangolin parts, and got the feds involved, and like those are all the stories that we get, and they're never like this herbal shop is a community center and it's serving seniors and really promoting health and wellness in our community. But that's not the story that's told. That's like I think that's what we really need, and I think mainstream readers or viewers really need to know that the places like this exist. And I think during the pandemic for our small businesses, it's like you should actually just go and get takeout there, because that's what they really need right now.
Well, we have about 13 minutes left in this session, so I wanted to remind folks that this is a great time to ask questions. I did have a question of my own. I recently read a piece in Rolling Stone that contrasted the coverage of Atlanta, the way it was done in mainstream media versus the way it was done in Korean language media. And they pointed out some fairly significant discrepancies in the coverage. And it just struck me, it reminded me that we do have ethnic media here in Portland, Portland Chinese Times, for example. What sort of relationship does APANO have with ethnic media, if any, Asian Reporter? And if you do have a relationship with them, how does that differ from your relationship with mainstream media?
Yeah, I mean, we try to work with ethnic media as much as possible, so like for some of our programs, like, the Oregon Worker Relief Fund, which provides, funding, direct assistance for undocumented folks, like we'll always kind of buy ads at at the media sources of a Korean paper, a Vietnamese paper, and the Chinese paper. Like the ads are, frankly, very, very affordable. And I think it's really important that we just support those businesses. So even when we do around elections, we'll always buy ads to be like, remember to vote. Here's how you do it. If you need information, come to our website. We publish our voting guide, which is usually now a C4 voting guide in 6 to 7 languages usually. So ethnic media is absolutely critical for our work, and we have a really close relationship with the Chinese Times in particular. That the editor and owner is on one of our advisory committees, and we work together really closely on a lot of different work, from like putting on the Jade District Night Market to small business assistance. I think that's also to say, like we actually also don't have a great relationship with some ethnic media. I think there's a real generational divide in a lot of ways, and I see this across the country, where some news sources have called us communists, and that's because we're very clear about our values and our kind of like worldview and their theory of change, and not every media source is going to agree with that, and that's fine, so but yeah, I think ethnic media is definitely underutilized and unknown to kind of like the mainstream community.
Yeah, where it really became front and center for me was right after Atlanta, when a journalist, and I'm sorry, I have forgotten the journalist's name, but who could read Korean, was tweeting out, parts of the coverage from the Korean language media. And it was just such a huge contrast. I think a lot of us are aware, for example, that initially mainstream media got the names of some of the victims wrong. Yep. Because of unfamiliarity with Asian naming protocol.
Oh yeah, that happens here all the time.
Yeah, like, not realizing that Asian names are different from Western names, and you don't have things like middle initials. But also what was really striking was how the Korean language media, and I'm referring again back here to the Rolling Stone article, really centered the victims, and the mainstream coverage, as you know, centered the suspect, the shooter. And that was just the beginning of some really noticeable disparities in coverage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when we have tragedies here in Portland, I've also just really noticed how differently communities respond. I think when someone is killed on a busy intersection, kind of in a traffic incident, you'll see kind of like on Bike Portland, like vigils, and like people really wanting to remember kind of like the victim. But I think when like on our little stretch of 82nd from like Division out to 122nd, we've had 4 Chinese elders die in the last 4 years. So I think that high crash corridor is kind of it's a systemic issue where we don't have like lighting or safe speeds or crosswalks and things like that. But like when that happens, like the victims' families don't want any media attention, and I think you saw that in with the Atlanta shooting as well, where we didn't publish any of the names because the permission from the families wasn't given yet, but like mainstream media like published the names as soon as they came out. So that was a big debate kind of in kind of a national Asian Pacific Islander serving like communities, is like, do we even like publish the names yet? And I think that like that's kind of maybe of a care and consideration that should go into telling these stories, that we didn't really see in kind of like dominant culture reporting.
Well, I wanted to follow up on that thread a little bit. You just mentioned the releasing of the names, and then we also talked about how the names were misrepresented. Do you feel comfortable, Duncan, speaking to some other cultural missteps that you see frequently in media?
Oh gosh. I don't think anything really, comes to mind right now, besides those kind of specific incidents. I think it's maybe just the invisibilization of our community, unless something bad is happening, and it's like something bad might be happening in the world, and folks in our community get blamed, which has happened kind of throughout history. So I think that that's not really a cultural misstep. I think that's just kind of a general systemic issue. And then I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the model minority myth and how the media reinforces that. It's like Asian folks are like in the news if they like win the spelling bee, or if something is bad happening in the world, right? And there's not really like a happy medium. And it's also like, so there's a model minority myth, and then there's really kind of the need for disaggregated data. So like, I believe that data is often kind of weaponized against us, and it's easy to have that, right? When if you take aggregated data for Asian Americans in like Multnomah County, like, or Washington County, like Asians make more than white people. And if that's the graph that you put up in your article, like that's what people are going to see, and that's how decisions are being made. But if you disaggregate it and you look at, if you kind of like health or economic outcomes for Japanese Americans versus like Samoan Americans, the differences are like night and day. But like those kinds of stories aren't highlighted, and then decision makers don't see them. So like, one thing that we've been working on at APANO is, Portland State University, they have, a Black Studies program, Native American, Latinx, and they've never created an Asian American Studies program, even though like 12%, I think, of the student body is Asian American. And then same with like at the state level at the Oregon Department of Education. There's a Latinx success table, there's a Black success table, and Native American success table. No one ever thought to create an Asian or a Pacific Islander one. And like we're spending like billions of dollars on education, and like our community is left out because of that kind of the way that the data is portrayed, and the lack of voice kind of like in representation. So like, I think that's kind of what we're up against a lot of times in reporting, is like Asians are doing great, but like that's not true if you like disaggregate it and look more deeply.
Yeah, it also speaks to the lumping of a very diverse population under the single AAPI umbrella,
Right.
which I see both sides of it. I see why there's the AAPI umbrella that exists, but at the same time, it's a really huge umbrella.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a big movement now, right? Conversations right now to actually just further disaggregate and have the Asian data and the Pacific Islander data, especially because the differences are so stark, and since the Asian community is so much larger, it masks over kind of all the needs of the Pacific Islander community.
There's a comment in the chat that I would like you to address. Would be nice for APANO to have a list of referrals/resources for AAPI community to access, categorized in legal, medical, housing assistance.
On our COVID page, we do have a lot of resources kind of split in those categories. And we try to update that as much as we can.
Okay, great. All right. We're approaching our time here. So sort of the last chance to get in. I'm just going to go through the chat real quick and see if there's any questions I forgot. If people want to unmute themselves at this point, if I didn't get to your question, feel free to jump in here.
Yeah, I did have one. Hi, my name is Edgar Composano. I'm the education reporter at the Oregonian. And Andrew had mentioned earlier, I'll just ask what I was going to ask. Reporters or newsrooms will often have folks from APANO or other organizations come in and maybe like be guest speakers so that our reporters understand what your concerns are and, maybe how to approach sources within your organization. But I'm wondering how valuable you feel it might be if, say, you had regular like town halls or maybe even an occasional town hall where members of the newsroom came to you so that members of the community could ask us, well, why did you frame this story this way? Or, how do I get a hold of you so that I can either learn about journalism or maybe get attention on a particular issue?
Yeah, I think that's an amazing idea. We'd love to host that and have you all out, and maybe we can share some snacks. And we also have a youth program, and I think we're always looking for kind of like career pathways for youth, and I think that would have so many great benefits to be able to ask you all the questions that we've always wanted to ask.
Well, Duncan, I want to thank you very much for being so generous with your time today and being so frank with your discussions and thoughts. I want to also thank everybody who attended. We did record this session, which I'm sorry, I neglected to mention that at the beginning, but we did record this session. And so if you're interested in that, in receiving a copy of that recording, please let AAJA Portland know. Thanks again, everybody. And
I'd love to get a list of the members. I mean, like when we have stories, I like just have a couple of people I reach out to, but it'd be nice to have a wider net. So I don't know how to contact you all. That would be super valuable.
Would you be willing to give your email out here so folks who are on this call can?
Yeah, super easy. It's just duncan@apano.org. And yeah, if you want to send me your contact, I'll add you to our list.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.